Paul Tripp has said that um, when you build a house, you don't uh, get all the wood and all the bricks and you sort of put it all together and you get it to kind of stand up, and then the whole work crew comes and ceremoniously drives a huge fat nail into the house, and voila, the house is built. It's not how it works at all. The house is built over the course of months with hundreds and thousands of nails throughout that building. In the same way, our lives are built over the course of hundreds and thousands of little moments. And that's the case with our children, and that's what this text is kind of describing. There's lots of little moments when this formation takes place. I'm going to hop on this when question. This kind of gets us, we're not going to talk a whole lot about it, but this idea of a Christian worldview, a Christian way of seeing the world. I think the fact that kind of thing exists, that because Christ has grabbed us, we see the world differently, that helps energize the fact that this thing takes place all the time. And I'll explain that in a second. But Leslie Newbigin, British, he was a missionary to India for a long time, and then he was a priest at the Anglican Church and also taught at either Oxford or Cambridge. But he says, at the heart of the Christian message was a new fact. God had acted in a way that, if believed, must henceforth determine all our ways of thinking. It could not merely fit into existing ways of understanding the world without fundamentally changing them. Sally Lloyd-Jones from the Jesus Storybook Bible, which I know we sell in the bookstore, and I think it's a recommended book at the end of this little packet that you have. But she says, Jesus is like the missing piece in a puzzle, the piece that makes all the other pieces fit together, and suddenly you can see a beautiful picture. Now, she's talking about Jesus and how he fits into the scriptures, but her point applies to all of life. The missing piece of the puzzle, you plug that piece in, and all of a sudden, this coherent, comprehensive picture comes into focus. One more. This is Paul in Colossians. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creations, referring to Jesus. For by Christ all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is also head of the body, the church, and he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself will come to have first place in everything. For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of his cross. Through him, I say, whether things on earth or things in heaven. Paul saying Jesus is the glue of the entire cosmos. It's all held together through Christ. I think of one, I didn't list this quote, but one more that I love from C.S. Lewis. He says, I believe in Christianity as I, what is the quote? Basically, I believe in Christianity like I believe in the sun. Not only do I see it, but by it, I see everything else. All the same idea, right? The entry of Jesus Christ, second person of the Trinity, into this fallen world, his death, resurrection, has completely changed everything. And so if that's the case, we've got a lot to talk about as parents. There's not a moment in our day when we can't connect. Actually, Ben, in our group, Ben made the point about Jonathan Edwards, in what Ben has read of Jonathan Edwards, has noticed how he could take a rock, just a rock on the ground, and he could follow its little thread back to Christ and back to the gospel. And if we're understanding all of life in light of Christ, then we will have very few moments where we don't have anything to say about Christ, because he's in all, he's through all, he holds all together. The how question. You see both. You see a couple of things. And I mentioned this a second ago. Teach them diligently. There's a formal instruction taking place, as I said earlier, but there's also informal. And even kind of the formation and education is not reduced to like a school experience. It's much more ingrained in real life. And then finally, the who question. I'm going to make one quick point on this, and you see it in verse 6. It says, "These words that I command you today shall be on your heart," parents. Older generation, shall be on your heart. Okay, that precedes the command to teach them. In other words, and somebody said it in our group, I believe Lynn made the point, we've got to be transformed by this gospel. We've got to be transformed by this message. We've got to have taken these things to heart before we can teach them to our children. That is so critical. You can't give what you don't have. It's as simple as that. And the scriptures are crystal clear on that point. And you see it here in this passage as well. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is look a little bit more carefully at just how this formation takes place. How is it? So we're taught to teach, and we're taught to shape and form our children so that they grow into Christ-likeness. But how are we formed? How are we shaped? That's what we want to look at right now. And I'm going to begin by talking about our target, our educational target. It is important that when we think about schooling, we typically reduce it to like the head. That's where you get smart. That's where you shape your mind. That's the target. But that's not, good schooling should be about more than that. It should also target the affections, the heart, the desires. And it should also be done in such a way that students are propelled toward loving action in the world. Hands, right? There should be a response, an action as a result of what has been learned. And there's got to be balance too. If you're at the gym and you see this guy and he's just bulging, his biceps are huge, he's just this huge person, and then he gets up off the bench, he's got these tiny little stick legs. He's out of balance. Like he's all upper body. In the same way, if we focus on one of these to the neglect of another, we're sort of creating disproportionate Christians. Big heads, small hearts, or big heads. Churches even track with this. There are head churches that are all about theology, all about doctrine, and they are cold, lifeless, could care less about the world. That's not good. Similarly, there are churches that are heart churches that are all about just loving Jesus, loving people, feeling it in the worship service. There's absolutely no theological content to inform any of that. And so they're sort of just like blowing in the wind. There's other churches that are all about social justice, all about the hands, right? Let's get involved, get engaged. But there's no theology informing it. They have hearts that are shaped, and so they grow sort of self-righteous about their service. Okay, so churches kind of can fall into this trap as well. Now, as educators, as parents, we need to target all three of these. And Scripture says the same, right? Renew minds, Romans 12:2. You should be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The word transformed is the word where we get our word metamorphosis from that Greek word that says transformed. It's not used very often in the New Testament, just a couple of times. But every time it's used, the Spirit is close by. It's a transformation that happens only by work of the Spirit, a complete and utter transformation. So yes, we want to transform minds. It's important to remember too, and I think this is a helpful point. In the movie School of Rock, Jack Black, who's this substitute operating under false pretense, he arrives at the school the first day, and the principal says, "Is there anything else I can get for you or help you to settle in?" He says, "Just give me minds to mold." And that's what we think of education oftentimes, is just minds to mold, as if the student is this passive little lump of clay, and we have complete sovereignty and control, and we just sort of shape them however we like. That's not how teaching works. Not for us, at least. Maybe at God's level, that may be how it works, and the idea of clay is actually a metaphor that's used. But not for us. And you'll quickly realize this as parents, right? You can't get your child to do what you want them to do. The clump says, no, I'm not going to go to bed right now. So we've got to recognize that. And here, the transformation comes as a result of the Spirit's work, right? So we rely on the Spirit for this kind of heart change. It's a humbling reminder for us, but an important one. And that's not even really all we do, and not what we should be primarily about is the renewing of minds. I'm going to suggest that the heart is the most important target. If you had to identify the most important target, it would be the heart. And you see that in Luke 6, verses 43 through 45, and I'm gonna read that for us. It says, "For no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor are grapes picked from a bramble bush. The good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks." The heart is the fulcrum for all of our actions. We live our lives out of the heart. We can have all of the right ideas in our head and completely not live in alignment with those things because we live our lives out of the heart. James Smith, who's written a book called Desiring the Kingdom, he's written a number of books kind of on this topic, but Desiring the Kingdom is the book I'm going to be referring to. He's had a big influence on me. And he makes the case that we live our lives more out of the gut than we do the mind. We feel our way through the world more than we think our way through it. And worldview, he says, is more of a matter of the imagination than the intellect. And this point has far-reaching implications for us as parents. In fact, much of everything that follows from what I'm saying right now is going to come out of this idea that it's out of the heart that we live our lives. I'm going to read a quote from Smith so we can kind of get a little better feel for what I'm talking about. He says, "I suggest that on one level, Victoria's Secret is right just where the church has been wrong. More specifically, I think we should first recognize and admit that the marketing industry is operating with a better, more creational, more incarnational, more holistic anthropology. Anthropology just means like what it means to be human, understanding of the human, than much of the evangelical church. In other words, I think we must admit that the marketing industry is able to capture, form, and direct our desires precisely because it is rightly discerned that we are embodied, desiring creatures whose being in the world is governed by the imagination. Marketers have figured out the way to our heart because they get it. They rightly understand that at root we are erotic creatures, creatures who are oriented primarily by love and passion and desire. But meanwhile, the church has been duped by modernity and bought into a kind of Cartesian model of the human person. Now, Cartesian, he's referring to René Descartes. And René Descartes is a philosopher, and he said, this is his famous quote, "I think, therefore I am." He basically was trying to figure out a foundation for how he could understand himself as a person. And what did he do? "I think, therefore I am." Like, all of my identity as a person comes from the fact that I am a thinking thing. And that thought has rippled throughout history, recent history. So the church has bought into this kind of idea that like we are at root thinking things. And in doing so, we've wrongly assumed that the heady realm of ideas and beliefs is the core of our being. These are certainly part of being human, but I think they come second to embodied desire. And because of this, the church has been trying to counter the consumer formation of the heart by focusing on the head and missing the target. It's as if the church is pouring water on our head to put out a fire in our heart. What if we approach this differently? What if we didn't see passion and desire as such as the problem, but rather sought to redirect it? What if we honored what the marketing industry has got right, that we are creatures primarily of love and desire, and then responded in kind with countermeasures that focus on our passions, not primarily on our thoughts or beliefs? What if the church began with an affirmation of our passional nature and then sought to redirect it? So I've been in my own work as a school head. I've been asking these questions for a few years now. I know Sacred City has been asking the question and has been kind of grappling with these questions. And one of the results of that has been the liturgical nature of the service. Because according to James Smith, and I think all of church history, individuals are formed through these kinds of practices. They're hitting us at almost like a subconscious level even, shaping our loves and our affections. I mean, the frightening thing is this. We could follow Deuteronomy chapter 6 to a T and have disastrous consequences if we're not hitting our children at a heart level. We could become Pharisee factories if we're not hitting, if heart transformation's not happening. Just like big church, little church needs Jesus and needs the gospel. And so before we even begin, the problem, of course, is we can't love the right things. Our heart is naturally bent towards loving either the wrong thing or the right thing in the wrong degree. Okay? Our heart is just off. And we need this fundamental transformation of our heart to even be able to begin to love the right thing and to free ourselves from this fundamental selfishness that has entangled our heart. And so what I want to do right now is go a little bit deeper. So we want to renew minds, we want to renew hearts, we want to address hands, we want it all to lead towards action in the world. The heart is the focal point, but now I want to get even deeper and look at the dynamics that go on in anyone's heart. Imagine, if you will, an elderly woman crossing the road. What do you do? What do you do? I mean, of course, we're all going to say you go and help the lady, correct? Most people would do that. I mean, most people are good people. Like, they want to help people that need help, right? Romans chapter 3, verses 10 through 12. I'm going to read that real quick. When we lived in Shawnee, before we came to Iowa, we lived in Oklahoma, and I met with a guy who had grown up in the church, but he was no longer a believer, and he was pretty frustrated at the church in a lot of ways. And he had a lot of beefs with Christianity, but one of his beefs was that this idea that all people are like sinners and evil, and that original sin had them gripped. And he said, like, my neighbors are not Christians, and they're good people. I just can't see that. And one of the passages that he would have trouble with is a passage like Romans chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, which says, none is righteous. No, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Okay, so that's a pretty powerful claim. And in a lot of ways, that claim seems counterintuitive, because we do see our neighbors that may not be Christians, or maybe Muslims, or they have some other faith commitment, and they're doing great things. So how do we explain it? Well, I'm gonna lean on Jonathan Edwards again, because I think he does a great job of explaining this. He says that there are two types of virtue. There's common virtue, which is good behavior driven by selfishness. And then there's true virtue, which is good behavior driven by a genuine love for others and the other, for God, right? So, the person that is helping the elderly lady across the street. Apart from the Spirit's work, Edwards would say, and I think Scripture supports it, that the good behavior of that person is driven by a selfish motivation. Here's why they're doing it. They're doing it because either they're fearful that if they don't do it, they're going to look like a jerk. What will other people think if I don't help this lady across the street? Oh, I better do this so I don't look like a jerk. Or they look around at all the other people not helping the old lady cross the street, and they say, these people are jerks. I'm better than them. I'm going to go help the lady across the street. At a heart level, and those thoughts may not even go through the person's mind, but at a deep level, that's out of where they're operating at, in one of those two areas. I mean, think about your own children. I think this comes up in our own households. If you have siblings, have you noticed that when one sibling is just awful, the other one turns into this angel? Like, what's going on? It's always one of them that's a struggle, and it's usually not, and they can get into battles, but typically when one's being really difficult, the other one turns into an angel. Why? They're not an angel. It's common virtue. They see an opportunity. They think, man, I can be the good child. I can be better than that. And so they sort of get in line. And it's great. But that's kind of common virtue happening in the home. This is why the older brother in the parable of the prodigal son, he looks so good on the outside. He's got common virtue coming out the wazoo. And yet, it all comes crumbling down. The heart is exposed. What was behind it was exposed in a moment when his younger brother, returns home, and he has hatred for that younger brother. He has hatred for his father, he was supposedly obeying. See, the obedience was not at all for the father, as it becomes evident. And that's the thing about common virtue. It's happening at a heart level, so you don't see the motivations that are going on. I mean, common virtue is better than nothing. The world would be far worse if common virtue did not exist. But it's not the ultimate goal, because it doesn't root out the main problem, which is our obsession with self. And this is why, every once in a while, someone who has an otherwise squeaky clean life, all of a sudden, they have an affair. They commit adultery. Or they cheat on their taxes, and everybody's just like, why? How could this have happened? Well, their morality was really was reinforcing the fundamental selfishness of their heart. And so they were simply acting in a manner consistent with what their morality had taught them to do. They were being selfish, just like they had been throughout all the good times. So we need more. We need heart transformation. And true virtue comes only through the gospel of Jesus. The gospel of Jesus Christ dissolves the fear and pride that drives common virtue. More to the point, the gospel eats away at selfishness, which is the root problem. So if you imagine the heart with an S in it, it's almost like a Superman. Only it's not super heart, it's selfish heart. And coming out of that heart are two little branches, the branch of fear and the branch of pride that animate. We oftentimes vacillate between those two, sometimes feeling superior to others, sometimes feeling inferior. The gospel eats away at that fundamental selfishness. It eats away at the fear that drives our good behavior at times. How does it do that? Well, the gospel tells us that God loves us more than we could ever imagine. And that gives us a security that melts the fear that we have towards what others think. It also chips away at pride, because the gospel tells us that we are a horrible sinner in desperate need of God's grace. The heart is entangled in sin more than we even realize. And so we can't be pride. We have no basis for pride in and of ourselves. And so over time, the gospel just sort of eats away at the selfishness. And in the process, frees the heart to begin to love the things that we ought to love. And as a result, to begin to live our lives in a manner consistent with the gospel. So let's look at how this might impact how we discipline in the home. If the heart is a focal point, this makes the discipline of our children very difficult, or at least more difficult, frankly. The reluctant apology. So sibling A takes toy from sibling B. Sibling A is forced to give toy back to sibling B and also provide an apology. And sibling A gives that apology, does what you ask them to do, but does it like this. Sorry. Are they obeying you at that point, and are they loving? Kind of not. If our target's the heart, are they obeying? No, they do not. They're not. Their heart is not, has no love and care and desire to regain fellowship with their sibling. Not at all. So what do you do in that instance? What do you do? This happens all the time in our house. Tell them you're sorry. Sorry. And one of our children gives this awful look. There's so much anger in his face, and he's saying sorry, and just like, that's not okay. So what do you do in that moment? I will say, until a student is about 5 or 6, they really have difficulty empathizing with anyone. If you ever tell a 4-year-old, that made that child hurt, they're kind of like, so there's no, it just developed the when question, right? It's just not really happening at that point. Now, it's not to say you don't do it, but just recognize there's some developmental limits there. I'll tell you what we try to do, and this is where I'm kind of coming to you as a struggling parent. We'll pull Henry or whoever that child might be, pull him aside, and say, we'll say, you didn't. I mean, I'm thankful that you said what you needed to say, and you said you were sorry, but your heart was not obeying in that moment. You did not want to say you're sorry. And our desire, we want you to love. You need to love your sister and fellowship. One of the things Sarah always asks is stealing a toy worth breaking fellowship with your brother or sister? And of course they're thinking, yeah. I mean, of course. Yeah, sure. But here's the point. Over time, by saying that, the truthfulness of that claim will stick. It'll stick. And so, and that's part of the struggle, is that you feel like you're talking, and there's nothing happening, but over time, these things will stick. So anyway, I think my point is, let me give an illustration, and then I'll try to come back to the point. Paul Tripp gives another good illustration that I think is very helpful. He describes having this apple tree in his backyard that produces these horrible apples. They're rotten. You would never eat them. They're hard as hockey pucks. And one morning, he says, pretend that one morning I tell my wife, I'm going to go fix our apple tree. And so he goes to the store, and he goes to the construction hardware store, and he buys a staple gun. He goes to the grocery store, he buys buckets of these beautiful, shiny, glorious red apples. And he walks out to the tree, shakes out all of the rotten apples, and he staples in a perfectly symmetrical fashion these red apples. And he goes back inside to his house. He says, look, I fixed the apple tree. Now, you think about that, of course it's stupid. I mean, the apples are going to rot in a matter of days, and they're all going to fall down, and those nasty apples are going to come back. But here's the thing. We actually oftentimes discipline our children as though we're apple nailing. Like if we just stop the behavior, then we've succeeded. And we haven't, because it's the same stuff's going to crop back up. The red apple's going to fall off the tree and the nasty rotten apples are going to come back. So we have to hit them at a deeper level, at the heart level. That's our focal point. That's our target. Ted Tripp, who he's written a great book called Shepherding a Child's Heart. It's Paul's brother, and he has a quote that helps us in this regard. He says, "A change in behavior that does not stem from a change in heart is not commendable; it's condemnable." So, back to the question, how do we address the heart? I think one of the key strategies in doing this, and again, it's the Holy Spirit's work, but pulling our child aside and asking a few probing questions. Why did you do that? Why did you do that? How did that make your neighbor feel? How did that make your sister feel or your brother feel? Was it worth doing that, and was it worth losing fellowship? The consequence of that action. Over time, over the course of 18 years, if you continually probe down to this why you're doing and what does that say about your heart, maybe even over the course of 35, 40, 50 years, it's going to have an impact. It's going to get them to think deeply about their lives.